Um, yes, thank you, Megan. We are supposed to be recording. So thank you everybody for being here today. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to do this presentation for all of you. As a brief housekeeping note, if you're attending remotely via Zoom, please make sure you keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. And if you're attending in person and you choose to log into the Zoom meeting to view the presentation or anything closer, just don't connect to the audio via your device. You'll get a little prompt that asks if you want to connect to audio and just tell it no. That's just because Zoom doesn't let you turn your volume all the way down. So if you do choose to log into the Zoom meeting while you're in the room with me, just don't use the audio. It'll prevent feedback loops. So my name is Claire Tibbetts, and I am the Executive Director of the Autism Society of Greater New Orleans. And here is a quick look at our training agenda for today. Can you click onto the presentation there for me, Megan? There we go. At times during this presentation, you may find some of the information that I share with you to be surprising, perhaps even contrary to other trainings or information you've received from other sources. And you may even find yourself uncomfortable at times. Discomfort's a really natural part of learning new things. And I encourage you to sit with any discomfort you might experience, but don't allow it to distract you from learning today. I encourage you to note down questions you have as we go, either in the chat via Zoom if you're on Zoom, or on a notepad or a piece of paper or one of my flyers if you're one of my in-person attendees today. That way you don't have to focus on remembering questions throughout the presentation. And I will leave time for questions at the end, ample time. When you're done typing, Megan, I need to progress the slide. There we go. So we are going to start off with a primer on neurodiversity, ableism, and information about language use and preferences. And all of this information has been informed by the work and advocacy of autistic and otherwise disabled individuals. While the term neurodiversity originally developed within the autistic community, the neurodiversity paradigm is not about autism exclusively, but about the full spectrum of human neurocognitive variation, recognizing that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways, and that there's no one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving. So let's take a look at a real-world example to get a better understanding. Some of you guys have iPhones. Some of you have Androids. Some of you might even have Google phones. An Apple app won't work on an Android phone. That's not because the app or the device is bad or wrong or broken. They're just different operating systems. And the same logic applies to the concept of neurodiversity. To accommodate for neurodiversity, we can change our approach and adapt to support differences. I need to progress the slide. So what does neurodiversity affirming mean? To be neurodiversity affirming, as we just discussed, neurodiversity is the idea that neurological differences, such as autism, are natural and expected variations of human brains. To be neurodiversity affirming means accepting and embracing neurodivergent brains as equal, valid, and not broken or in need of repair. Neurodiversity uses a strength-based rather than a deficit-based approach. Autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people are celebrated for who they are under a neurodiversity affirming model. Neurodiversity recognizes that support should target the challenges that autistic people experience and not their natural autistic ways of being. When working from this lens, providers and caregivers recognize that it is inherent value in living a disabled life and do not seek to eliminate disability, but rather to enhance strengths and support an individual through challenges they experience. Post-identification support for autistic people should never focus on changing or treating the person's neurology, but instead on self-advocacy and self-determination. As caregivers, you can seek out neuroaffirmative practitioners or insist on neuroaffirming goals and practices from your current providers. Providers who work from a neuroaffirming lens focus on the individual's priority areas of support, for example, adapting both the physical and social environment to better fit their neurotype. It's also important to respect autistic culture, identity, and authentic autistic ways of being. The idea that an autistic culture, communication, and identity even exists is very new to most people. Autistic people have distinct ways of being in, exploring, and learning about the world. Autistic ways of being should be validated, a positive autistic self-identity cultivated, mental health needs attended to, all alongside supporting and understanding of specific perception and sensory differences to empower self-advocacy, and also just take time yourself as a caregiver to appreciate autistic experience through this lens. So what is ableism? Ableism is a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or the other. Ableism is intertwined in our culture due to the many limiting beliefs about what disability does or does not mean, how able-bodied people learn to treat people with disabilities, and how disabled people are often not included at the table for key decisions. Just like most forms of discrimination, ableism often is perpetuated by non-disabled people with good intentions or other disabled people who've been socialized with ableist norms. There's a few common areas that contribute to ongoing ableism in our society. The first one, how people have learned to treat disabled people and the language used to discuss us. I say us here because I do identify as a disabled person. I am hard of hearing. As small children, many non-disabled people are taught to be extra nice to people with disabilities. Open the door for them, run and press the elevator button for them, ask if they need any help as they're crossing the street, etc. While this seems to have good intentions, it also reinforces the societal belief that disabled people couldn't do any of these things on their own. And it takes the responsibility away from our societal structure to create truly accommodating communities. The ongoing use of stigmatizing language toward disabled individuals and the use of ableist language in general public also contribute to a view of disabled individuals lacking competence and agency. Additional information about language will be discussed in upcoming slides. Ableism is also perpetuated when disabled people are not included in decisions that involve them and in general. Disabled voices should be centered in decision-making at all levels, and this is still not a common practice. When disabled people are excluded from the opportunity to contribute meaningfully in ways that work for them, ableism is reinforced. The medical model of disability is another major contributor to ableism, especially in healthcare and school settings. What is the medical model of disability? The medical model of disability frames the body of a person with the disability as something that needs to be fixed, suggesting that typical abilities are superior and that physical or mental impairment should be cured with the help of an outside force. This framework, which is still embedded in modern approaches to healthcare and education, frames an individual's impairment as the cause for their inability to fully participate in society. This model puts undue burden on disabled individuals to change themselves in order to be included and supported. While this model of disability is necessary because our healthcare systems, schools, and government services are based on it, it's also stigmatizing, perpetuates harm, and often stands in the way of policies and ideas that would promote meaningful inclusion and supports for disabled people. So what should we do instead? Here's the social model of disability. This is developed by disability rights advocates in the 1970s and 1980s, so it's been around a while. This suggests that if societies were set up and constructed in a way that was accessible for people with disabilities, those individuals would not be restricted from full participation in the world around them. In other words, the social model of disability views the origins of disability as the mental attitudes and physical structures of society rather than a medical condition or impairment within the individual. This model is more inclusive and places the burden of inclusion and adaptation on society rather than on disabled individuals. But this model has some limitations in that it ignores the existence of impairments experienced by many disabled individuals that would limit their ability to live their lives and achieve their goals, even if they were fully supported and accommodated. Oh, There we go. It's cool. So the cultural model of disability seeks to overcome the limitations of both the medical model and social model of disability. This model recognizes disability as a natural and valuable part of human variation and as a distinct cultural element in the lives of disabled individuals. This model also rejects the pathologizing elements of the medical model of disability and recognizes that impairments do exist for many disabled people that impact their lives and would continue to do so even if the society around them was fully supported and accommodating. This model is relatively new and still evolving. However, recognition of disabled communities having their own culture is not. As an example, the deaf community has long maintained their own unique culture that they take pride in. And the autistic community also has its own unique cultures that organizations like ours recognize and honor. So a little bit more about language here. While many of us have been taught to use person-first language, putting someone's personhood before their diagnosis, a growing number of adults surveyed, specifically autistic adults, share a preference for identity-first language, or autistic, citing that autism is integral to who they are. Individuals who prefer identity-first language often say that their autism is as inseparable a part of them as their gender and race, with both of which are commonly used to describe people using identity-first language. For example, you wouldn't say a person with womanness. Another major disability community that prefers identity-first language is the deaf community. However, in general, many people with intellectual disabilities still prefer person-first language. It's important to note that within the autism and broader disability community, there are many different experiences, preferences, and perspectives. And so it's important to ask how individuals you work with prefer to identify. For minors who may not have had a chance to learn about these terms or the reasons people choose them, you can support self-determination by giving these individuals access to information to make their own choice and respecting how they choose to identify. Shifting to using identity-first language as a default can be a powerful way to show that you are centering the views and needs of autistic and otherwise disabled individuals. Autistic advocates have been speaking out for years against the use of functioning labels, for example, high functioning, low functioning, yet their usage persists, especially in school and medical settings. These terms, in addition to being harmful and disrespectful, especially to those who are labeled low functioning, they just also don't provide useful information on how to best support an individual. And they have been used to both justify not appropriately supporting individuals labeled high functioning and segregation and low expectations for people labeled low functioning. It's more informative and useful to talk about an individual's support needs in specific areas. For example, someone may have high support needs for personal hygiene, but low support needs for feeding and toileting. Moving away from functioning labels is an important step in reducing ableism in our communities. The non-speaking community in general prefers to use the term non-speaking and not non-verbal. Non-speaking is an umbrella term which describes anyone who does not use speech as their primary, reliable form of communication. Non-speakers include people who do not speak at all, people who are minimally or unreliably speaking. Non-speaking advocates have shared they prefer to identify as non-speaking because the term non-verbal implies that they do not have words and cannot use or understand them. However, this is untrue, as there is a large community of non-speaking individuals, both with and without a co-occurring intellectual disability, who communicate via AAC devices or spelling on a letterboard or a keyboard. The term nonverbal has also historically been used to justify low expectations and deny agency and self-determination to these individuals. A common phrase in this community is non-speaking does not equal non-hearing or non-thinking. And advocates report many situations where individuals, educators, and caregivers have spoken about them in hurtful ways right in front of them. Too often, autistic individuals who are non-speaking or who have unreliable speech aren't given opportunities to engage in age-appropriate activities or self-advocacy. When the information that is presented is inaccessible and when there are no accommodations in place to allow for alternative methods of communication, the message that is received is often, "You won't understand this," or "You don't need to know this." The autism community is beautifully diverse and part of the broader neurodiversity community. As we move on today, we'll review some foundational aspects of autism. So what is autism? Autism is an umbrella term for a range of neurodevelopmental differences which impact the way the brain processes and uses information. I'm going to say that again because I don't know that a lot of times people have really been given a definition of autism. So I'm going to say that definition for you again. Autism is an umbrella term for a range of neurodevelopmental differences which impacts the way the brain processes and uses information. It impacts everyone differently, sometimes in very visible ways and other times in very subtle or invisible ways. Expressions of the different categories of autistic traits will vary from person to person and can include communication differences, autistic communication styles, intense focuses or passions, sensory sensitivities or differences, and a preference for routine or repetition. These traits can impact individuals in many different ways, and some individuals may not experience all of them. Or, because autism is a dynamic disability, their expression of particular traits may vary from day to day. Do you have a question? Yes, one of my participants in the room just asked if we're going to get a copy. I can send out a copy of all the slides, and we are recording these sessions. So we will also send out a link to the recording on YouTube when it is uploaded. But good point, I'll send the slide decks out too. So, like I just said, autism is a dynamic disability, and the expression of someone's particular traits might vary from day to day. Autistic advocate Ashley McKay says the following about this color wheel visualization of autism as a spectrum of difference. The autism spectrum isn't a straight line of severity of symptoms. Instead, think of it as a highly detailed color wheel. Every small curved segment of each color slice of the wheel represents an autistic trait. The sample diagrams to the right show how an individual's personal configuration of autistic traits might look. There's a whole spectrum of building blocks that make us who we are, and no two autistic people will have the exact same set of blocks. But we have our similarities because all of our blocks came from the same place. Every autistic person is unique, and their experiences are all highly individual. But a common experience among autistic individuals is feeling disconnected from the larger community and negative experiences in schools and healthcare environments. So here's some fun facts and statistics. As of 2023, 1 in 36 children are estimated to be diagnosed with autism in the United States, and around a third of autistic children are identified with a co-occurring intellectual disability. Nearly 3/4 of autistic children are diagnosed with a co-occurring medical or mental health condition. And so this means that in addition to challenges an autistic individual may experience as a result of being autistic, they also have additional challenges from their co-occurring medical conditions. Anxiety disorders affect up to 40% of individuals with autism and may be worsened by autistic masking, which is the process of suppressing autistic traits and ways of being in order to appear more neurotypical or to gain more social acceptance. Autistic masking begins early in life, often influenced by experiences in school settings where autistic students are expected to suppress their autistic traits in order to fit into classroom and social expectations. With increasing evidence showing that autistic masking is linked to autistic burnout, mental health difficulties like depression and anxiety, and a substantially increased risk of suicide later in life, it is vital to increase the inclusion and accessibility of our communities, healthcare environments, schools, and families. Intersectionality is the concept that social categories such as race, gender, age, etc., are interconnected and create overlapping systems of oppression or advantage. The huge variation of intersectional identities in the autistic community makes it unique. Autistic individuals exist in every population and within every marginalized community. Autistic individuals represent all ages, all races and ethnicities, gender identities, socioeconomic status, and may also have other disabilities, such as being deaf or hard of hearing, being blind, using wheelchairs to ambulate, just to name a really small few. Studies have found that autistic individuals are more likely to identify as transgender or non-binary, with one study showing 24% of gender diverse individuals being autistic as compared to 5% of cisgender individuals. Autistic individuals with multiply marginalized identities are at a greater risk of negative educational experiences, including the use of seclusion and restraint. So let's talk a little more about some of those autistic traits. Differences in the way that information is processed, accessed, and used is central to the autistic experience. Some individuals may struggle to process auditory information, but gain access when text is provided. Others may be visual processors and, regardless of their reading level, require visual support to ensure effective understanding. In terms of communication information processing, this can be broken down into expressive and receptive processing. An autistic individual may struggle with expressive language, which may cause them to be completely non-speaking or situationally non-speaking, or they may struggle with receptive language and require a longer processing time to understand spoken instructions or information. Someone might struggle with both expressive and receptive language at the same or different times, or exclusively one or the other. Access to verbal communication will vary from person to person and from setting to setting. And access to speech does not always lead to access to effective communication, particularly for individuals with apraxia. It's important to adapt our communication style, including the speed and the modality, spoken versus written versus symbols, to the need of each individual. Communication differences for autistic individuals are very common, with current estimates showing 25 to 30% of autistic individuals are non-speaking throughout their lifespan, impacting individuals both with and without a co-occurring intellectual disability. And additionally, another 20% may present as situationally non-speaking when they're stressed. These effects occur, again, really want to emphasize, both with and without co-occurring intellectual disabilities. It is very common for medical providers and schools to tell you that a non-speaking child has an intellectual disability because the tests they're using to determine that are not capable of actually measuring what someone who cannot speak and who cannot volitionally complete motor movements knows. While communicating using spoken words formed by the mouth is the most common and popular type of communication for most teachers and professionals and caregivers, and myself, there are many other ways people can communicate, including using sign language, icons or pictures, alternative augmentative communication devices or AAC devices, or spelling on a letterboard with or without assistance. These individuals typically identify as spellers. Another common communication difference for autistic individuals is difficulty regulating their own tone, pitch, and volume of their voices. Autistic adults have explained that for them, the tone, pitch, and volume of their voices is often not within their control. And they request that people listen to the content of what they say rather than trying to assign a meaning to the way in which they said it. I clicked too fast. My bad, guys. Autistic social communication is often different from that of neurotypical peers, but that does not mean that autistic students and individuals' ways of socializing are wrong. There is increasing evidence that difficulties with social communication and understanding go both ways and are a result in differences in what autistic and non-autistic people see as important. This is commonly referred to as the double empathy problem, coined by Dr. Damian Melton. Additionally, there is evidence that non-autistic peers form immediate negative thin slice judgments about their autistic peers when audio and visual cues are available, so in person, audio recordings, videos, etc. But that these judgments do not occur when reading written content created by the same autistic people. This points to a systemic difficulty with inclusion and acceptance of autistic individuals, where they are constantly interacting with people who have formed negative opinions of them before getting to know them at all. It leads to a commonly described experience where autistic adults say they feel like everyone who meets them dislikes them immediately for seemingly no reason. Taken together, this research shows that it is at least equally important, if not more important, for non-autistic peers to be taught how to understand and interact with their autistic peers, just as we currently teach autistic individuals about non-autistic social communication and behaviors. It is the responsibility of non-autistic peers, professionals, and educators to learn more about autistic communication styles, just as autistic individuals are taught to understand neurotypical ones. So I mentioned apraxia earlier on the communication slide. What is apraxia? Apraxia is a neurological condition that occurs when the brain is unable to deliver correct movement instructions to the body, even if the person has the ability and desire to execute them. Apraxia affects the motor movements involved in speech, as well as the motor movements for the rest of the body. 87% of autistic individuals have some degree of apraxia and dyspraxia. IQ testing is not valid for individuals with apraxia and should not be used to determine placement or educational opportunities. IQ tests rely on a student being able to respond verbally to prompts, manipulate objects with intentional motor movements, and control eye gaze, all of which are difficult or impossible for individuals with apraxia. When viewed through this lens, it becomes clear that IQ tests do not measure intellectual ability or the ability to process information, especially for these individuals. For individuals with apraxia, establishing a reliable method of communication is the most important place to start to help them through any challenges they may be experiencing. Non-speaking advocates often talk about feeling trapped inside of their own bodies, which do not respond to what their brains instruct them to do. With consistent support from a trusted regulation partner, these individuals can improve their ability to conduct purposeful motor movements. This is actually the basis of programs like Spelling to Communicate and the rapid prompting method. Just as a fun little aside here, to the people on Zoom or the people in the room, could you just put your hands up if someone in your family is non-speaking or has apraxia? Pretty good percentage of people. Yep. And how many of you guys have been told that your individuals are not capable of understanding anything by someone? Yep. It happens a lot. And it's one of the things that our organization is trying to change. We're trying to get this information to teachers, to healthcare providers, and let them know that these individuals have things to say. These individuals are capable of age-appropriate learning opportunities. And what they need is a way to communicate what they know, because their brains and their bodies don't communicate. So very important to me personally and us as an organization to work on that. Presuming competence. Here's how we can work on that. It's important for educators and caregivers to presume competence when interacting with all individuals. Essentially, presuming competence means that we should treat every individual, regardless of their outward presentation, as a full autonomous human being who understands language. The two primary principles of presuming competence can be summarized as everyone has something to say and everyone can learn. Many professionals, caregivers, and non-speaking advocates also refer to this as the least dangerous assumption. It causes less harm overall to assume that every student can learn, than to assume that some of them can't. There are stories from many, many non-speaking individuals where they share that they spent years trapped doing remedial lessons and having more complex education withheld by well-meaning people who did not presume competence and who believed that their lack of consistent responses indicated a lack of understanding. In case you're wondering, all these slides are in the teacher presentation. You can let your schools know we do presentations for schools, and these slides are in there. Sensory processing. Sensory messages are filtered differently for a large majority of autistic individuals, leading to a huge range of experiences. A person might be sensitive to one type of sensory stimuli, but then under-responsive to other types of input. This can create challenges in everyday situations that increase stress and anxiety, impacting someone's sense of safety in their body and in the community. Every autistic person's sensory system is unique. And so while one person may have hyperacusis and be extremely sensitive to sounds, another might be under-responsive to auditory stimuli. Sensory processing can vary from day to day and situation to situation, and stressful environments can cause an increase in sensory sensitivities. Later in the seminar series, we are going to have an entire presentation related to understanding sensory differences. So this is just going to be an overview. What is stimming? Stimming, short for self-stimulatory behavior, is now being reframed by many as self-regulatory behavior. It is a form of sensory seeking aimed at keeping your sensory system in balance. Repetitive movements, sounds, or fidgeting can help people with autism stay calm, relieve stress, or block out uncomfortable sensory input. It can look like many, many things. It can look like your kind of stereotypical idea of rocking or flapping or jumping or spinning. But it can also look like opening books and smelling them. It can sound like humming. Regardless of what it looks or sounds like, autistic advocates share more and more and more about what stimming feels like, reporting things like, I don't know why my body needs to do this, but if I don't, I'm headed for sensory overload. Allowing for safe stimming has become central to conversations about autistic wellness in recent years. While the examples listed on this slide are some of the most commonly discussed stimming behaviors, stims can be anything that serves to help a person regulate their sensory input. And they might be culturally specific in some intersectional autistic communities. For example, one example that's shared often by Black autistic advocates is swinging the beads in their hair and listening to the sound, or clacking acrylics together. Even twerking has actually been listed as a culturally relevant stimming behavior by some of the Black autistic advocates I follow. So it's kind of a fun fact. To help you understand the importance of stimming as a regulatory action, think about the regulating stim behaviors that you engage in and how they make you feel. You know, socially acceptable, and I hate to use that phrase, socially acceptable stims that many of you might identify with include playing with jewelry, running your fingers through your hair, scrolling through social media on your cell phone, listening to a favorite song, tapping your fingers or knuckles on the table, or even chewing gum. Everybody has stims that they engage in. It's just autistic stims are often more visible, but they also have the same purpose. So this is not by any means an exhaustive list of sensory seeking and avoiding behaviors. This is just intended as a jumping off point for you to consider your own sensory behaviors and those of your family members. Some sensory seeking and avoiding behaviors may relate to multiple senses, and some behaviors could be either seeking or avoiding, depending on the individual and the context. Being a detective can help you with identifying what the behaviors the family members that you have engage in mean and how to best support them. Sensory seeking and avoiding behaviors can also overlap with stimming. The types of stims that your family members enjoy can actually help inform you when you're selecting sensory supports. So here's some seeking behaviors. Chewing on items or clothing. That's going to be an oral taste stimming behavior for seeking. Smelling people and objects. That's a seeking behavior. Touching or stroking everything. Tactile. Staring at moving or spinning objects would be a visual stim. Being attracted to loud noises or making their own repetitive sounds can be an auditory seeking behavior. Bumping into things and people can be a proprioception seeking behavior. Another common proprioception seeking behavior that has come up in a few presentations, and I wish I would remember to add it to the slide, is the thing where kids drape themselves over your back. That is a proprioceptive seeking behavior. Taking very hot or very cold baths or showers is an interoceptive seeking behavior. And spinning or jumping would be vestibular seeking. Some avoiding behaviors. Eating only carbs or crackers. That is a sensory avoiding behavior for oral or taste. Avoiding bathrooms or stores with strong smells. That would be an olfactory, a smell avoiding behavior. Wearing only very specific types of clothing would be a tactile avoiding behavior. Preferring dim lights or wearing sunglasses, that's a visual avoiding behavior. Covering their ears or making sounds are auditory avoiding behaviors. You notice here that I listed making sounds in both seeking and avoiding. That is one of the most common behaviors that can be either sensory seeking or sensory avoiding, depending on context. An individual that's in an environment that is too loud or has aversive auditory input may adapt that by making their own sounds that they can control. So if you have an individual that they make a lot of sounds in class, you need to consider that either they need more auditory input or they need less. You can try one or the other and see what happens. So an avoiding behavior for proprioception would be like stiff movements or a refusal to participate in sports. An avoiding behavior for interoception, your sense of your insides, could be avoiding experiences that trigger internal feelings. Maybe you don't like to watch movies that have really strong emotional themes. That's an interoceptive avoiding behavior. Maybe you don't like running because you don't like the way it makes your heart feel. That's an interoceptive avoiding behavior. And then a vestibular avoiding behavior can be anxiety or hesitance about car travel or having meltdowns in moving vehicles. That can be a vestibular avoiding behavior. I have a lot of vestibular avoiding behaviors because I have very severe motion sickness. So sensory overload and anxiety. Too much stimuli, not enough stimuli, or the wrong kinds of sensory input can cause anxiety and even physical pain, which can lead to extreme distress. Sensory overload happens when sensory stimuli overwhelms your ability to cope. This can be triggered by a single event, like an unexpected loud noise, or it could build up over time due to the effort it takes to cope with sensory sensitivities in daily life. Sensory overload can feel like an intense anxiety, a need to escape the situation, or difficulty communicating. When your brain has to put all of its resources into sensory processing, it can shut off other functions like speech, decision-making, and information processing. Sensory overload is a common phenomenon shared by children, teens, and adults who are autistic. One who describe their experience saying, if I get sensory overload, then I just sit down. You get what feels like fragmentation. It's weird, like being tuned into 40 TV channels. Some individuals might shut down. Others might experience your autonomic nervous system's fight, flight, and freeze responses. Aggressive and disruptive behaviors in autistic individuals are often caused by aversive and overloading sensory input. Chronic pain leading to reduced ability to cope with other sensory experiences is another common cause of aggressive behaviors and often goes unnoticed for some time, especially for non-speaking individuals. An individual experiencing sensory overload does not need to be chastised or punished. Rather, they should be supported in diffusing, de-escalating, and re-regulating with comforting sensory input. For many classroom settings, healthcare environments, and even just unfamiliar environments can create a perfect storm of anxiety, which can lead to aggressive and disruptive behaviors in some cases. But the good news is, with more training for these environments and access to accommodative supports, we can reduce stress, leading to better outcomes. So next, we're going to go over some really high-level practical tips to support diverse sensory and communication needs while you wait for all of the rest of our in-depth seminars coming up. We will be deep diving into sensory supports, parenting strategies, and communication supports in their own sessions, but this is just a quick overview to get you started today. By designing environments that meet the needs of autistic individuals, especially those with some of the most complex needs, we are removing barriers and creating access for a much larger population, for anyone who needs social, sensory, environmental, cognitive, or communication accommodations. How do we create accessible environments? To plan for sensory and environmental support, you can identify sensory and physical barriers in your day-to-day life and the environments you frequent. Designing sensory-friendly environments can mean different things for different people and even for different places, but I'm going to share some examples of high-impact strategies that we consider to be go-to supports that are relatively simple solutions and could be applied in most settings. The very first one is facilitate choice and autonomy at all points in the day. Facilitate as much choice and autonomy as possible. This is a proven strategy to reduce dysregulation and increase accessibility. To not have control of your environment, of your sensory system, of your communication system, of your body, it takes a toll. Anxiety will increase when we feel like we don't have control over a situation and we're not sure what to expect. Offering meaningful choices everywhere possible can reduce anxiety. When you have the ability to control this in an environment, reducing fluorescent lights when possible, like using half power, natural lighting, lamps, or if you have control over a space, equipping the room with like fire safe light filters can be very helpful. If you don't have control over a space and you know it's going to be too bright, bring some sunglasses. Have a variety of seating options. Consider the seating options in your house, in your child's classroom, in libraries, other spaces you go to. If you have control over the space, can you add a beanbag, a wiggle stool, or a bungee chair? Are there options for group seating, places where somebody can sit alone with more privacy? Can you provide spaces where your child can work and play on the floor, either seated or laying down? For example, and I share this example a lot because I found it really personally valuable, bring a picnic blanket to your doctor's appointments. This can help children who prefer to sit on the floor. My child loves the floor. She is allergic to chairs. So I bring a picnic blanket that I can spread on the floor so I don't spend our whole wait time fighting with her about sitting in a chair because the floor is gross. I can be like, stay on the blanket because the floor is gross. And she's like, okay, cool. I love the floor. So noise canceling headphones, very, very common, popular support. Not every individual likes noise canceling headphones, but some individuals do. Some individuals also might like something softer, like loop earplugs, the sorts of things that dampen sound but don't eliminate it. Or you can also allow for the personalized use of headphones or earbuds to listen to music that creates a preferred auditory environment, especially in crowded or noisy situations. We have Exhibit A over here. My brother is listening to things to support his preferred auditory environment. Thank you, Eric, for being here. You can also have sensory fidgets. These can provide individuals with regulating sensory input. Having a variety of fidgets in different textures and styles can help meet the most sensory needs. Tactile, visual, and auditory fidgets are all common options. So many fidget toys have elements also for multiple senses. So poppers are tactile and auditory. Spinners are visual and tactile. You can kind of look at things like that. Think about the stims that your children like, and you can align fidget toys to the types of input that they tend to seek. So other things, reduce crowds. Common problem areas for crowd exposure at school are going to be things like drop off and pickup, class change, assemblies, and lunchtime. For individuals who are sensitive to crowding, consider accommodations that reduce their exposure to crowds in as many environments as you can. Provide visual supports. So these are important for all ages and all literacy levels. Visual supports can help autistic individuals understand what to expect during the day and what the requirements of assignments are. Visual supports such as first, then can be helpful. But it's also important to not use them as a reward system because that's not their intention. Visual supports can help transitions go more smoothly by providing advanced information to autistic individuals so that they know what to expect. Embrace stimming. As we previously discussed, stims are vital regulatory behaviors for many autistic individuals, and they should be accepted and embraced in all environments, home, school, the community, to allow individuals to stay regulated. If for some reason in a specific environment, you need to substitute a stim that's your child's go-to stimming behavior because the stim is causing other problems in that environment, it's important that you substitute it with a stim that accomplishes the same purpose. Because if you try to substitute an auditory stimming behavior with a tactile one, you're not going to actually make any difference. So really thinking about that happens a lot at schools where they're like, oh, well, your kid is making sounds during class and that's disruptive to the other children. And they're like, well, we'll give them a little band to kick. But that's not the same type of sensory input. And then they're baffled why it doesn't work. Another really important one, really important, provide options to escape an environment if needed. Another extremely commonly dysregulating experience reported by autistic individuals is feeling trapped in an unpleasant or aversive environment. Planning ahead to offer options for how to escape an overwhelming or difficult environment can improve a person's ability to engage throughout the day. And then provide additional time to complete tasks and requests, as well as additional time for transitions, can be a powerful support that reduces overall anxiety levels. For example, my daughter needs to know starting 1 hour before we are leaving somewhere, like a playground or the zoo, that we will be departing. If I only gave her 5 or 10 minute transition warning, people are like, oh, tell them 5 minutes. That is extremely dysregulating to her. She needs to know an hour ahead that we are leaving, and then she needs reminders at 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and 5 minutes. And that is the only way she can transition out of an activity. So that whole transition takes an hour, and I know that, so I plan for that. So earlier we discussed some of the communication differences in our community and that too often those who communicate in ways other than speech are often left out of age-appropriate educational activities, self-determination, and self-advocacy, and the ability to participate in their own medical care. Access to communication is central to closing equity gaps in education and healthcare and to reducing disruptive and aggressive behavior in the home environment. Here's some communication supports you might already be offering or you might have heard of. So high-tech AAC, including tablets with AAC apps like Proloquo2Go, TD Snap, Touch Chat, Cough Drop, Weave Chat, there's a whole bunch of them. Or durable medical devices that are intended solely as communication devices. Low-tech AAC, such as core word boards mounted on walls as individual sheets, printed on pillows, communication card books, handwriting notes, symbol supports, anything basically that isn't being run on a high-tech device can be low-tech AAC. Written prompts for instructions in addition to spoken ones, including offering choices for students to point to or circle as appropriate. And then letter boards intended for individuals to spell out what they would like to say. On the table in the back, and for those of you who are attending via Zoom, I can email it a copy of the communication board that we give out. We do have a communication board that has a very limited amount of vocabulary. It's a single piece of paper, and it does have a letter board on the back, really just intended as like an additional support. You want to be able to make sure that someone communicating with AAC has access to as much vocabulary as possible, but these are a free, easy thing to carry around as a backup. And I will send out a copy of it. You can reprint it. It's totally free. Give it to anybody you want. If you have a child who uses AAC of any kind to communicate, ensure that their device is out and available to them at all times. Their AAC is their voice and should be treated as inseparable from their bodies, just like your vocal cords are inseparable from you. There are no prerequisite skills a person should have before being introduced to robust AAC options, and withholding communication supports can do more harm than good. And you can tell your child's school, I said that. I will tell them myself if you want me to. So here's an example of low-tech AAC and its use in the community. These are images of our healthcare communication and letter board that we gave out through our vaccine education initiative. These are a really great tool, and these specific boards were developed by the Autism Society of America's Council of Autistic Advisors and an AAC users group specifically for use in healthcare environments. We've been giving these boards out to community members for the last couple of years, and we also included one in every healthcare accessibility kit we gave out during the period of the grant funding. Communication and letter boards can and have been used to facilitate two-way communication between healthcare providers and non-speaking individuals, allowing these patients the ability to self-advocate, and be active participants in their own care. You can see on this board that there's, nurse. We also have hurt, help, stop, yes, no. Very important that any communication support you create have ways for people to say no. And that when those people say no, you honor that. Give them that control over their own bodies. If you have any questions, obviously we're going to do a Q&A, but if you have any questions that are more detailed, don't hesitate to reach out to us via email or by leaving a voicemail on our answering system. And links to everything will be sent out afterwards. So I really appreciate, you guys joining me today.